You are listening to a White Phosphorus Pictures podcast.
Broadcasting under the night sky from the edge of an undisclosed jungle on the Gulf of Mexico, I'm Christopher Garitano, your voice in the night. For the next hour, allow me to be your guide into the bizarre unknown, the fantastic macabre, and together we'll journey to that borderland between fiction and reality, a place beyond all rational explanation. We are now off to the witch.
What do you want to be when you grow up?
A movie maker.
Kids had like their Mickey Mantles and their, Babe Ruth heroes. Mine was Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff, and it's just I was always the weird kid on the block.
And my career is my work, so I always know where I stand, period.
Intestines, kidneys, brains.
This is what you've been wanting to do your entire life.
Seeing people think that I have money, which is ridiculous, man. I say, Ma, come on, man, I gotta make rent here.
I'm not out to change the world, though, dude. I have no time for that, man, because all I got is my life. Action!
I somehow know that I'm incapable of making something that absolutely sucks.
That was from a motion picture documentary titled Horror Business that I made 20 years ago. It wasn't regarding the greatest horror directors in cinema history, but the people who seemingly had no chance in the business, that were inspired at a very young age by the greatest, and against all formidable odds decided to answer the call of their mysterious and sometimes detrimental obsession. Tonight's guest has lived his life, for better or for worse, with this calling that every filmmaker from Stanley Kubrick to Ed Wood inherently understood. We'll hear his story after this commercial break.
After these messages, we'll be right back.
You are listening to the Off to the Witch podcast, where we explore that bizarre borderline between fiction and reality and all subjects arcane. Journey over to my YouTube channel and subscribe now at youtube.com/@offtothewitch for a variety of extras and special features, including the Off to the Witch mini docs with further insights on many of the latest episodes, as well as previews and behind the scenes of my forthcoming investigative series, Off to the Witch Presents, as well as the anniversary edition of my motion picture documentary, Montauk Chronicles. And follow us on social media. All links are available at linktree.com/Garitano7, GARETANO7, and stay tuned for more Off to the Witch.
Halloween. Newsweek magazine calls it a superb exercise in the art of suspense, the most frightening flick in years. Halloween. The Chicago Sun-Times says it's so scary, I would compare it to Psycho. It's the kind of picture, says the Chicago Tribune, that forces you to sleep with the lights on. A masterpiece, says New York's New Times. Halloween, from Compass International, rated R.
Welcome back to Off to the Witch. I'm your host, Christopher Garitano. And tonight's guest, Terry R. Wickham, is an independent movie maker for over 30 years. He was obsessed with horror films from an early age, and that obsession led him to create a series of pictures, regardless of budget, fear of critical reaction, or lack of profit. It's the voice and calling of a true artist, an irresistible compulsion only a movie maker can understand. Tonight, we'll learn about the life and perspective of a guerrilla filmmaker far from Hollywood at the dawn of his new project, which you can learn more about in the description of this episode. As a technical note, please forgive a slight shift in audio quality on my end of the interview. I'm in the process of upgrading my equipment, and all will be back to normal on the next episode. So here's my interview with Terry R. Wickham.
I was born in Logan, Utah. My parents were from Utah. My dad was from the Smithfield area of Utah, which is northern Utah. And I lived there till I was 2. And then my father got a job. Well, actually, I think my grandma and grandpa moved to Seattle first, and then my mom followed them. So my dad obviously was with my mom. So then we grew up, basically moved to Seattle. And I really consider Seattle as my hometown because, when you're 2, you don't really remember all that stuff. But Seattle, we first lived, I believed, in like downtown Seattle area, close to my grandma and grandpa. And then we moved up about 30 minutes north of there to an area called Silver Lake, which is part of the southern part of Everett. Everett's probably the 4th biggest city in the state. And it's famous because that's where Boeing, the big airplane manufacturer, has one of the biggest buildings in the world. My father ended up working there. And so that's kind of where I grew up. And in terms of movies or my first movie experience, it kind of relates to that job being at Boeing. My dad worked the late shift. And because he worked the late shift, like any boy or maybe even a girl, you want to wait up to spend time with your dad. So my dad would come home late. And what was on late at night was those horror film. There was a station called Nightmare Theater. And in Seattle, it was a guy called the Count. And he had a cape and, fake fangs and the whole bit. And they were showing movies that were, the old Universal monster movies like, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Mummy. And then they even got into some of the stuff that came out in the 50s with the giant atomic, Godzilla and, whatnot, it. And then eventually I think they even started releasing some of the Hammer films because I was born in 65. So I was guessed that when I think back to scary movies, I think like when I was 4 or 5 years old, I started watching those with my dad. And my mom thinks that that's part of the interest why I love it so much is because I spent time doing that with my father. And I think that's probably the way it started, but then it became much more than that, as you might know.
When you were a kid, was there ever a time where you wondered if these things were real or not? Because it kind of hit you at a time where you're still being shaped by the world. And it hit me at a time also where I had just limitless imagination and you were being bombarded by all this wonderful cinema. Did you wonder if some of that stuff was real? Did it hit you at a time where you weren't sure if it was real or not?
Yeah, I have to be honest. I think that's the best policy that when I watched those movies at the time, when I think back to that, they definitely affected me in a way that I was scared. I remember I was scared a lot. And what was weird about that was I was the oldest of 9 kids. Now, obviously, not all 9 kids were there at the same time, but as we kept adding family members, my dad would always say to me, "You're the man of the house when I'm not here. You're the leader when I'm not here." And, I thought back to those times when I was scared out of my mind, scared to walk into my room because it was dark, scared to go in the basement of my grandma's house because I had seen Dracula or Frankenstein or Creature from the Black Lagoon. So, and I also remember somehow you made me think, Chris, when my father and especially my father would go shopping, food shopping the most, he would go food shopping. I remember in the magazine section, now this is way before it was even in the 80s or 90s, but at the time, I kept seeing this monster magazine on the rack, and something about it drew me over to it. And obviously, though I was frightened of scary movies, there was an attraction to it. It's weird how that happens like that. But I remember I went over there and it was Famous Monsters of Filmland. There was also a magazine called Creepy and Eerie, and those were the things that really drew me over to them. Um, and I bought a lot of those issues when I was a kid. I don't have them now, but that's kind of what. And I also remember back at that time, talking the early '70s, they used to have almost a baseball card set that came out that was horror films, not Friday the 13th. That was later. It was all Hammer and Universal Monsters and Godzilla. and you could collect these little baseball cards. There must be someone out there that knows the company name, but I remember I collected those of Mole People and Hunchback of Notre Dame, all that stuff. So that's the stuff I think back to. And also, we didn't have it like the kids of today, where you have Netflix and Hulu and, go on your laptop and watch movies. We didn't have that possibility back then. If you didn't see a film in the theater, the only way you could see it was if it was on TV. And if it was on TV, it would be cut. It'd be very late at night. And so I remember watching like Steven Spielberg's Duel when that first came out on TV. I saw that when it first came out. Like, I didn't know who he was. I certainly wasn't a director or anything at the point. But I remember seeing that movie with Dennis Weaver and the truck following him. That had a big impact on me. Kolchak, the Night Stalker. There was a show called Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. There was a show called Night Gallery, which Spielberg was actually part of that. Those were the things that really hit me as a young age.
And and that stuff is so pure in terms of just direct storytelling and imagination, and for a child to absorb all of that is a powerful time, because I think now it's different. Like, we have all of that stuff is available again, but I wonder if, coupled with everything that came after it, let's say past the 80s, may have messed with kids' heads a little bit, where back then it was just it was pure. It seemed more pure because it was limited. There wasn't so much of it, like you just said, and it wasn't always accessible. You either had to tune into it, or you had to show up to the movie theater. And here's the thing. Was there anything at the time, outside of the material, outside of the motion pictures, that kind of crossed the border between fantasy and reality? In other words, did you have any kind of ghost experience or anything that led you to believe that the things in the movies might be real?
Yeah, well, you had those documentary type shows like In Search of, and things like that really, really had an impression on me because they'd be talking about UFOs and Bigfoot. And, obviously when Jaws came out in 75, I actually saw that. My grandma and grandpa took me to see that in a drive-in. I saw that in the drive-in, believe it or not. And I also think that my uncles had played a part in my movie making or movie interest because they took me to the movies quite often. Remember, my uncle Lamar took me to see Star Wars shortly after it first came out, and he actually made the effort to take me to like the biggest theater in Seattle, which was in huge, like widescreen with surround sound at that point. And so I think that that had an impact. But there was a situation back in 1978, the summer of 78, where a friend and I were staying out in the woods on a July night. We were just camping out there to have fun. I lived in a housing development called 21 Oaks. We had moved from the Silver Lake area a little bit further east to 21 Oaks, was considered Everett. And our backyard was basically woods about 10 miles east, and then it ran about 20 miles north and south. But there were houses all around us, but we were in the corner of that housing development. But my backyard was basically going into the woods. And we went out there to the woods just to roast marshmallows and hot dogs. And we went to a little store close by and bought some goodies to eat. And while we were out there, I started feeling sick, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. I didn't know if it was the food, all the junk we were eating, but I felt like sick to my stomach. And my friend was a bully, and a lot of kids were afraid of him, but we were friends. And I kept saying to him, his name was Phil Strout. And I said, Phil, I just feel weird. I feel like we shouldn't be here. And I don't pretend to be a psychic or anything like that, but I grew up in a Mormon family. And in the Mormon religion, though I'm not an active Mormon anymore, and I haven't been for probably 40 years, they believe in a thing called the Holy Ghost, which is like the still small voice that warns you of danger. Now, I wasn't thinking about that when I felt sick, but my mom, when I spoke to her later on, and my mom's very religious, like a Mormon to the core, she told me she kept waking up with her heart beating really fast, and she felt like there was something out in the woods that was dangerous. She didn't know what it was, but that was what she felt. She told me that later. So when I got that feeling strong enough, eventually I convinced my friend that I think we should go back. And I'm trying to make this short because it's kind of a long story. But we started walking back and we left everything but our BB guns, because we had BB guns, and we our flashlights. And when we got about I'd say a third of the way back to my house, remember, this is the woods. There's no lights out there. It's pitch black. And as we're walking, we heard this loud whistle scream. I can't duplicate it. I don't want to sound silly. It was more of a whistle than a scream, but it wasn't just a whistle. And this was about, I'd say, 12:30 at night, and in Everett, Washington. And me and my friend stopped dead still. And I was ahead of him because I knew the woods better than him. So he was following me. And we were in this area that was shaped like a gully. And because of that shape, the sound kind of must have carried even more. And when I think back to that sound right now, even, I could tell you it was coming from where we were at. It sounded like it was over to the kind of, I'd call that the northeast of where we were standing. And I turned around. We did not hear something coming. We didn't hear footsteps or bushes. There was no sound. It stopped. My friend would not move. Remember, he's a bully, a tough guy. He would not move. So I said, Phil, come on, we got to go. And he wouldn't go. I go, Phil, we got to go. I actually had to grab his shirt, pull it to make him go with me. And again, there was nothing coming after us. At least we couldn't hear it. So we started, you can't run through the woods in the dark, but we were walking fast. We got down to the house, and just like a movie, it was crazy. The sliding glass door of our back of our house was locked, which makes sense. Why would you leave your door open? But we couldn't get in. So we kind of hurried around the side of the house, came to the front. It was also locked. And then I remember we hid a key under a place. So I went and got the key. And when I went back to open it, all of a sudden the door started opening up on us. And we both kind of jumped back, almost screaming, not like a girl, but kind of startled. And it was my mom. And she was coming out to go outside to yell into the woods because she didn't know where we were, to try to get our attention. But I don't know if that would have ever worked. But we were coming in as she was coming out. So that was just a crazy situation. Just to finish the whole story, what ended up happening was we were sitting in the living room just kind of in shock. I mean, if you think about it, we were quiet. We were unresponsive to each other. We weren't talking. We were in a form of shock. And I remember thinking there was something we were missing. And as I stared at the wall after like a half hour, I saw a picture of my family. And I realized, wait a second, two of my brothers, Sid and Evan, and Phil's brother, Cecil, were actually staying out in the woods further than us. And I didn't even think about it to that moment. And certainly Phil didn't say anything. And I'm like, we got to get him. And I remember my mom said, you got to go get him. I said, Mom, I can't go out there. I don't know what the hell that was, but it scared me. It sounded mad. It sounded pissed off. And I've never heard anything like that. So I asked her if she could give me Dad's 30-30. I said, if you give me a weapon, I'll go out. She said something I think was very smart looking back on it, but she would not give it to me. And she said, because if you take that weapon and your brother moves and you don't know it's him, you could shoot him. And I think she was totally right. So we had to wait for my dad to come home. When he did, I told him. He knew I was not faking it. He got his 30-30. He said something, one of the scariest things in my life. He said, I don't know where they are. You're going to have to lead us out there. And I was like, oh my God, I'm the first guy that whatever this thing's going to swipe or whatever, I'm going to get hit. So just to finish out the whole story, Chris, we went out there. It was about 3:30 when my dad came home. I demanded Phil come with us because it was his brother too. We both had our pellet guns. My dad had his 30-30. We got out to them. Nothing happened. When we were coming back, they were asleep. They were sleeping in a tent. And they got their guns. So we all had guns in some form. We're walking back. I'm leading the way. We're on a thing where the trail was really small and I thought we were going to miss it, but we didn't. They kept saying to me, no, we haven't missed it. I might have been just scared. And as we were getting close to that trail, someone in the back of the line said, look, there's eyes. And I remember I didn't even want to look. I'm like, no, there's not. Like, I didn't even try to look. I was actually scared. And everybody stopped. And we looked to our left, which was to the west, direction of where my house would be back there a ways. Um, so we looked into the woods, and I would say about 100 feet away, through a bunch of bushes and a tree, there was something standing there that's head was above the lowest branches of this particular tree, which I would say was about 7 feet high, 6.5, 7 feet high. Now, the thing is, when I think back on it, and I've asked my dad about this, and I've asked my brothers about this, and they all certainly never forgot it, none of us could see its cheeks, its forehead, its chest, its neck, none of its body except for the eyes. Now, some people have told me you guys saw an owl. Well, if you know an owl, it doesn't have the eyes in the front. The eyes are on the side, and it moves a lot. Someone said to me, well, maybe you saw a horse. I go, how many horses are 7 feet tall and the horse's eyes are on the side of its head? Anyway, so I don't know if it's Phil or Cecil, but they said, shoot it. And my dad lifted up his 30-30 and he pointed it at this thing. And by the way, we could hear it breathing. It wasn't growling, it was breathing like, and if you think about something that's breathing that you can hear that far away, it is not small, it's big. So it was not coming at us, it did not move, it was very still. And my dad aimed at it, we all aimed at it, and it was a couple tense moments. And my dad said, we don't know what that is, and we don't know what it'll do if we don't kill it. So I think we should keep going back. And that scared the crap out of me because I knew where this thing was standing, it could cross over where the trail was going to cross because it was definitely in the same path, like maybe, a little bit ways away. I want to add one more thing to the story. I know it's a long story, but it's, this is all real. My brother and sister that were younger than us, going back maybe even a year or two before this, my brother Bart, who was not out there, and my sister Eva, who was also not out there, they had told me and the rest of my family that they had gone out in the woods and that an Indian came up to them on a horse. And he said, you really shouldn't be out in the woods. It could be dangerous out here. And he would put them on the horse nicely, take them back towards the top of the hill where the trail goes down to our house, and would let them off the horse. They told this story at least twice over the year or two before this. And I'll be straight with you. I never believed it. I'm like, why would an Indian on a horse be out in the woods? Now, the truth is, our neighbor that lived in the house across the street, which were older kids than me, had told me, and you're going to laugh at this because you may think it's fake, but it's real. They had told me that where this housing development was built was not far from an Indian, not just a burial ground, but like an Indian sanctuary. And they had told me there was a place out in the woods where you could go out and you could see where they kind of mingled, carvings on trees. I actually went and they took me out once and I saw it. And there was stuff that looked almost like a little house made out of wood. You could see all kinds of Indian carvings, because Washington has a lot of Indian population. So keeping that in mind, what my brother and sister had seen, what my neighbor had taken me to see, which I didn't believe was real, as far as the Indian on a horse. The next day, we went out to see what would still be there on the ground. And the only thing that we could find was horse tracks. And my second job was shoveling horse stalls. So I have been around horses physically next to them, shoveling horse manure. So I know what a horse sounds like. I know what a horse looks like. And their eyes are not in the front. And they move a lot and they make other kind of weird little sounds. And they're not 7 feet high with their head. So if you want me to tell you what I think it was, I think there had been some sightings of Sasquatch in our neighborhood, even a couple months before that, with a guy going into the house next to ours, checking the power in the back of their yard, which was also right by the woods. He had said he'd come face to face with Bigfoot. Now, I had never seen it. But what I think this was, if you take any kind of intellectual, intelligent, like putting the puzzle together, I think that there was probably a Sasquatch that did not like that we were starting a fire and eating food in its home, which was the woods. They probably also didn't like that we were making noises out there. We had BB guns. If there was an Indian on a horse, I certainly didn't see it. But what I'm thinking is, if there was an Indian, probably on a horse, that was watching us and watching the Bigfoot and making sure that we didn't collide. He was probably just making sure everybody was safe. And the truth is, nobody got hurt. We didn't end up seeing Bigfoot, but I guess maybe we might have with the eyes, but the only thing we could see was eyes, and it was like eyes with like a cat. If you shine the flashlight on the eyes, you could see it. When you took the light off, you could not see the eyes. Um, every one of us will attest that that actually happened in July of 1978.
That's amazing because that was at a time where there was quite an interest um, in pop culture, even in Bigfoot. Because you know, 10 years or so previous, you had the Bob Gimlin Patterson famous Bigfoot film that was shot in California. And then you had TV shows like In Search of and all of that stuff. And so, were you aware, and you had books, a variety of books, were you aware of the Bigfoot stories in pop culture at that time? You were, yes?
Not on an obsessive level, but I were aware of them because I was a horror kind of fan, so that was kind of horror reality, if you want to call it that.
Right.
Yeah, I'd certainly seen the documentary. I'd seen the Gimlin Patterson film. I had heard some of the stories in the news. Remember, of course, but this was before the internet. Media didn't travel as fast.
Of course.
Certainly, yeah. And you know, things were not so readily available as they are now. So in the primitive ways of the '70s at that time, I think we were aware of it. But certainly, I was not thinking about it when we went out in the woods that night. It was totally unexpected. So in that way, it's kind of a lot more legitimate because we weren't planning to have that happen. It happened just in the course of the events.
You
Yeah,
were caught off guard. Now, all
totally.
of this collectively lends to the inspiration to become a movie maker. And so at this point, your imagination was on fire. Everything between the things you watched with your dad to this experience, which is profound. You walk away with that experience, and I'm sure, you couldn't forget it, right? I mean, you thought about it after, correct?
Absolutely. That's something you'd never forget.
Okay. When was it? Huh. I would say outside of that realm as you're getting older, because how old were you when you had this experience in the woods?
I was 13.
So you were 13. At Was there anything else after that? Any type of sights in the skies or a ghost experience or anything like that? Because again, I truly believe this is all shaping you as a movie maker because those elements are in your films.
Yeah, you know, there were a couple other stories, especially not stories, real life events that took place when I particularly was living in that house in 21 Oaks and those woods. Um, you know, we grew up, my friends and I, my brothers, we grew up having a fascination with um, guns, not so much ourselves owning them because we certainly didn't have the money for that, but we had our BB guns and pellet guns. But because we grew up in the woods, we would go out and shoot. You know, I hate to say it, but we'd shoot snakes and frogs and birds and you know things. One time I killed a chipmunk, which I know sounds really bad, and we actually skinned it. I kept the fur as a little boy. I had someone do like a taxidermy thing on it, but that kind of shaped us. But we there was a place called the Sand Pit, which was an old dried up lake, and because we were you know this was before like again we weren't electronic age kids. We were kids that grew up in the woods outside doing things outside. So we would go to the sand pit and all these adults went down there and fired guns. So when we would go down there, we would find the bullet shells. We would found the casings from a 10 gauge shotgun, a 20 gauge shotgun. We would find all kinds of handguns like 357, 38, 44 Magnum. We would find big rifles like 30-06, 30-30, .458 Winchester Magnum. So we started reading magazines about guns. We would go to the logs, take our pockets knives. We cut out the tips of the bullet shells so we keep the casings and the actual bullet itself. So that was something we did as boys growing up there. Now, when you were down at that sand pit, you were in what was basically an old lake. So it was made out of sand, but it was surrounded by woods. And I can tell you there were many times that I was down there that I felt like I was being watched. Did I see what it was? I can't tell you yes, but I could tell you you got like the hair standing up all over your body, like the goosebumps, because it was pretty big. I would say it was about the size. It had like really three parts of it, like where there must have been little parts of the lake, and at different points bigger than others. But it was kind of elevated on the sides. It kind of went up, almost like a little bowl. And I just remember going down there. You had to go down these steep rocky dirt roads. People could drive cars down actually. And I just remember I felt like I was not alone. I usually wasn't there alone. I'd be with friends or my brothers. But one time, this was a story that's true. One time I was down there with my friend Andrew Crapella. We went to kindergarten together. And to this day, we're still best buddies. I'm actually going to Yellowstone Park in a month. He's such a good friend. He's driving down from Seattle with his wife, Kathleen, because he's never been there, just like I've never been there. And we're going to have dinner and breakfast together because he wants to see me and he wants to meet my daughter, which is really special. But Andrew and I were out there um, collecting bullet shells, and it came to about 5 o'clock. And he's like, listen, I got to go home for dinner. And it's like we found like the mother load of gun bullets and stuff. And I'm like, you know what? I'll stay back. Why didn't you go eat dinner? I'll stay here and keep collecting. I wasn't even thinking about what could be in the woods around me. That was not on my mind because we had found because when you went down there, you didn't always find a bunch of bullet shells. It had to be people that went down there. So we happened to find like a lot of shooting and stuff. So I'm sitting there down there, not thinking about anything. And maybe about an hour later, Andrew comes back, which was about an hour walk from, not an hour walk, about a half hour walk from where he lived, and maybe less, maybe 30 minutes. Maybe I'm over. I don't want to overdo it. 30-minute walk. So he gets back there, and 5 minutes after he gets there, the fire alarm goes. I mean the fire station that was about 2 or 3 miles south goes off. Now the reason I mention that to you is whenever that would go off, I don't know why or how, but it would attract the wild dogs that lived in the woods. Now, I don't know if they were just coyotes or if there was wolves included, but they would come down to the sand pit because people also dumped garbage there. So there was food and it was kind of on the side. So thank God he got there because the fire went off, the thing went off, and all of a sudden we heard the dogs start barking. And we're like, holy shit, they're going to be coming into the sand pit. So me and Andrew like dropped everything we were doing, made a run for the exit, which was this long, hilly dirt road. Not easy to get up it. It was pretty far to go up it. We get up it. We hear the dogs coming closer. I don't remember seeing them, but we could hear them coming. And we're both running as fast as we can. We get up, I call it like the second hilltop. And all of a sudden these trucks and Jeeps are coming down. And these guys slowed down and they saw us running like hell, scared out of our mind. And they're like, what are you guys running from? And we said, there's coyotes or wolves where they're coming to the sand pit. And they took off. They went down the hill. We didn't see what happened. We suddenly started hearing gunshots. So I don't know what they end up doing, if they just scared away the coyotes or wolves, but they were firing off guns. So we got lucky, and so I got lucky in so many ways because I was by myself for about an hour, and then he got there like 5 minutes before that happened. Just imagine by myself trying to run out of there, and then these guys came down unannounced. So we were really, someone was looking out for us above us. That's what I believe.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, these and all of these situations build a life. I was an outside kid as well. I was born in '76, so I wasn't around for iPads either. And it does, it shapes you differently because if you're only raised on that kind of thing and secondhand experiences through movies, I don't think you're going to have a dynamic personality to put into movies. I just don't think so. And so there's a lot that happened in your life that lends to being a storyteller and being a movie maker. It's part of your arsenal. And okay, moving forward a little bit in life. Let's say your late teens. By that time, had you had any interest in actually making motion pictures?
Well, the first thing that gave me any kind of interest in movie making was in 1978. I saw John Carpenter's Halloween, and it scared the hell out of me.
And okay, and a lot of people don't understand what it was like to see Halloween when it was new. They don't get it because there's so much in pop culture. You can walk into Target and buy toys of Michael Myers. Can you, as a storyteller, bring us back to what it was like seeing that movie when it was new?
Yeah, you bring up a good point, Chris, because there was not anything that was exactly like it that I had seen that gave me that powerful jolt. I think when I think back to the movie, the way John Carpenter made that film, it seemed like it could be anybody's neighborhood. And I lived in a housing development. So when you think about the Strode house and the Myers house, it was kind of like a neighborhood like I lived in. And I remember thinking, if this guy who seemed like he was a man could not be killed with a gun, could wait patiently to strike you, it didn't seem like he'd run after you. Even though he didn't run, he'd still get to you. He was quiet as a mouse. You couldn't hear him. He looked like a ghost with that white, deathly mask. So, and you couldn't see his eyes because they were covered with that black holes. So when I think of that movie, because it seemed like it was like kind of real, it just knocked me out. And looking back as it now as a filmmaker, you start to understand some of the reasons why. But I can just remember distinctly the day after seeing that film, I was on a baseball field. I was not in a game. It was not a game. It's just a bunch of friends playing baseball. And I remember being on the pitcher's mound throwing to my friends, and I couldn't stop thinking about Michael and the clothesline when Jamie looks out from the second floor of the house, or Michael at the school across the street next to the car he had stolen from Dr. Loomis, or when Michael, sits up when Jamie's in the hallway by the door, or in the hallway when she's outside of that room and he comes out of the darkness with the dimmer switch that Dean Cundy's set up as the DP. That stuff was in the music that John Carpenter piano, which is so haunting, and it's beautiful, but it's scary. I mean, I just couldn't get that out of my head. It like soaked into my soul, and I had never seen anything like it. And it changed me, and that it didn't make me want to become a director at that point, but it made me want to get involved of finding out about how people make movies. That was my first spark.
So John Carpenter's Halloween, and that was also at a time, I mean, so many movies were coming out. You had Ridley Scott's Alien. Obviously, you mentioned Star Wars previous to that, Jaws previous to that, The Exorcist previous to that. The 70s throughout the mid to late 80s were a fantastic time for motion pictures. And you were essentially absorbing all of them, correct?
Yeah, I actually think that that's the greatest horror film decade of all time for the movies that you mentioned. And if you want to add The Omen and Death Dream and, The Manitou and, The Fog kind of coming there at the end, you've got Phantasm, it's like this unrelenting, great decade of Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things, Black Christmas, best Jack the Ripper movie ever made, uh, which is Bob Clark, with Donald Sutherland, who just passed away, Murder by Decree. So that was just a beautiful time for scary movies because they just seemed like they were so real.
Sure, and it was an incredible escape. It held your attention 100%. I have to ask you, did you spend any time in the drive-in?
I did, and I think I spent a little bit with my father and my uncles, maybe more like Jaws and Star Wars and the Final Countdown and movies like that. But then when I was old enough to go to the drive-in without an adult, um, then I would go see a lot of horror films. And what I thought was so great about that was when they would double feature them. I mean, and by the way, I have to say this: the first R-rated movie I ever saw without a parent, a friend of mine named Damian Cordell, who grew up in that same neighborhood, we were going to go see Rocky 2, which had just come out, but also Phantasm had come out. And we went to the mall and we took a quarter. And I said, I want to see Phantasm because I heard it's great. I didn't know anything about the director or anything like that at that point. But he wanted to see Rocky 2. So we flipped the coin, and actually the coin won Rocky. Rocky 2 won the flip. We still went and saw Phantasm. So Phantasm, that Don Coscarelli, Angus Scrimm, Reggie Bannister, that was the first R-rated movie I saw without a parent, and that scared the shit out of me. That was amazing. But and then the drive-in after that, I can remember going to see so many great movies with my friends, and even on a couple of dates. I remember seeing House by the Cemetery with a double feature with Zombie, like a full side double feature. I remember seeing House on Sorority Row, that slasher film from '83. Mark Roseman did that great music score for that. I remember seeing that in a drive-in. I remember seeing the Texas Chainsaw Massacre with, I think it was Herschel Gordon Lewis 2000 Maniacs. That was a combination. And then I saw one of the worst horror films of my life. I remember seeing Blood Sucking Freaks, which was just a terrible movie, and I think that they put that with The Hills Have Eyes. Wes Craven. Not when it first came out, because I saw that with my friend on Showtime first, but they re-released it like 81, 82 with Blood Sucking Freaks in the drive-in, and I went and saw that. And that's just a great
And
movie,
and
you
it
know.
and that was a time where, you really didn't have a choice where to see the and these movies were independent films. They were being made from different people from different places. These weren't big studio pictures. And all of these most of the great horror films were from these independent places. And part of me feels like that's starting to happen again. In a week or less than a week, that movie Maxine comes out, and regardless of the studio behind it, it is not a major studio picture. It's an independent horror film, and it's a good time. I see a lot of them happening, and people are gravitating towards that again. And do you think that zeitgeist from that time period could be recaptured now or forthcoming?
I do believe that, especially with people like you and myself, making the effort to do that. I think I've got to mention something which I know you're going to appreciate, because I feel that it's very important to say this. I think we all owe uh, a great debt to really the godfather of independent horror, which you and I both know is George A. Romero. When you think back to Night of the Living Dead, which I did not see, I was too young when it first came out, but when you think about Dawn of the Dead in '78, which I didn't see when it first came out, but I saw it at a college for $2 at a local college in Everett in, I'd say, '81 or '82. And so then it made me go back and see Martin and Season of the Witch. But George A. Romero, to me, he was the guy who started that all for all of us. He started it for Hooper, before Chainsaw, before Bob Clark did Children for Children Play with Dead Things, before Carpenter made Halloween. I think George A. Romero is like the godfather of independent horror, and he should always be acknowledged of that. God rest his soul. Would you agree with that?
Of course, George was my hero when I was a kid, and luckily, making this particular podcast episode is an extension or an annex of a documentary I made 20 years ago that George saw and invited me up to meet him on the set of Diary of the Dead, and I shot a bunch of footage with him. Interviewing him, hanging out with him and zombies. It was great stuff, man. George was the biggest inspiration for me as a kid, and his team, including Tom Savini, to be a movie maker and a makeup artist and a storyteller. It was Romero 100%, and of course, obviously absorbing all these other movies. And so, for you, George connected with a lot of people that way. I think he created, like you were just explaining, an entire generation of movie makers. And the makeup artists back then too, we knew their names. You know, they were artists. We knew Rob Bottin, we knew Rick Baker, we knew Dick Smith, we knew Tom Savini. We knew their work. And I think we as movie makers need to make that happen again. We need to find these, these people. I found a few recently even. We need to find these people with portfolios and hold them up high, and show the world their work, showcase their work in our pictures. And that goes along with everybody else too. If you work with a cinematographer, you work with anybody. And if you want to recapture what happened back then, we need to make it happen. We're the independent filmmakers. That's what I believe.
I completely agree with you with that. And I think the other thing that George did for all of us is he came not from Hollywood. He came from Pittsburgh in a town that wasn't known for filmmaking. And I think the fact that he was able to put together these movies and make such great, impactful stuff that was, everlasting, I think it gave hope for the rest of us that we didn't have to be in LA. We didn't have to have a corporation behind us, that we could somehow, some way put together our own team of people, because none of these movies are made by one person. And like you said, Tom Savini, Michael Gornick, Pascal Bubba, all those guys he had back there in Pittsburgh, I would hope that that's what all of us are doing today, is putting together our own teams. Because, Chris, I just feel like if I'm going to go watch a movie on a Saturday night, I'm not looking for the latest big blockbuster, Disney or Hollywood film. I want to find those little independent gems that have a unique voice, that are different, that are not controlled by some board meeting, that these are guys that have a unique voice. That's the stuff I appreciate. I think that you and I and others like us, we need to make that happen too.
Yeah, I see it happening. I really do. I see a lot of creativity, imagination, even from people that I thought really weren't delivering, are starting to, and I'm impressed by their work. So again, it's it's something that I realized after I started to make movies that needs to happen. But before that was just pure dreams and imagination. And I want to continue to talk about that because obviously at some point, this was all building, building to a head for you. This inspiration, your fascination with movies, with special effects, and of course, Fangoria came out in '79. And Fangoria magazine, did you read that early on when it first came out?
Yeah, so I saw it in the store a couple times, and I'm being completely honest when I say this. I remember at the time I saw it, I didn't have a lot of money. And not that it was overly expensive, but when you're a kid, you don't necessarily have money all the time. And I certainly didn't come from a rich family. So I remember when I saw it a couple times that I don't really think I saw the first issue, but I saw it maybe I'd say like issue like 17, 18. The first issue I bought was issue 24 with extra on the cover. And so I'd seen it enough times that it definitely what I did was actually save my money. And I said the next time I go to my grandma's house with that 7-Eleven that has that magazine, I'm going to go buy it. So I bought issue 24 and I never looked back. I did not miss an issue after that. I didn't necessarily have a subscription right away, but I bought every issue that came out after that first issue that I bought with extra on the cover. And that opened a lot of things for me. I didn't realize there were other people like me out in the world. And when you had those subscribers ads in the back, which I thought was such a great idea, you could read that these people were all over the country, Michael Myers fan, George Romero, whatever. And I actually wrote to a couple of those guys, got pen pals with a few of them, Kenwick Cook, Michael McAllister. Those are some of my friends back, Sam Frost in Florida. But I also think that when VHS came in to play, I think that was another big thing in my career. But before we get to that, because I know you know a lot about videotape with your parents' store, I got to say there was one other movie that sealed me becoming a director. It was 4 years after seeing Halloween in June of 1982. I think it was the second day after it came out. in a theater. And again, I wasn't a director or knew I wanted to be a director at the time. At the time, I thought I would was when I started learning about film through Starlog magazine, and there was a thing called Cinefantastique, and I started seeing the stuff about behind the scenes of movies because you didn't have Blu-rays, you didn't have DVDs, you didn't have even Laserdisc really at that point that I knew of. So I was seeing it through these magazines, and I remember at first I thought it was special effects because I was so blown away by what stuff I saw in these horror films. Rob Bottin, Stan Winston, Dick Smith, you know, the list goes on and on. Rob Berman. So I guess in '82, in that June of '82, I went and saw a movie the second day after it came out. And when I was watching the film, I didn't put the two together. I like to be honest. I did not realize this while I was watching the film. So I'm watching the movie and I was floored. I think it's the best special effects I've ever seen to this very second that we're talking right now. I was completely blown away by the acting, the directing, the suspense, the makeup effects, the matte paintings, and that was John Carpenter's The Thing. And when I walked out of the theater after being completely leveled, I looked up at the poster and that's when it hit me. I said, wait a second. That's the same guy's name that was on Halloween. But I didn't get it while I was watching the film. And I'm being straight with you. I got it when I left the theater. And I said, that's the same guy who made Halloween. And it was at that very second, I said to myself, he did this to me twice. I want to do what he did to me to somebody else. And it was that moment. I didn't know how. I didn't know what the hell was, what a director did. But I decided at that very moment, I have to be a director like John Carpenter.
Yeah, I mean that movie's amazing, and obviously, you know, I know 100% why you felt that way, and there was so much hitting us at once at that time. I was watching all those movies too, and I know how you felt. I know how you felt. I know exactly how you felt at that time, and there's a group of us that do, but that time, like it was for us, won't be repeated. However, you just said it. I believe that a group and a time of filmmakers can inspire people to do that again. But the thing is, there were always horror filmmakers. I believe Rob Zombie coming in the early 2000s probably inspired a whole generation with his stuff. But going back to movies like Halloween and The Thing, and The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Alien, those movies are so powerful. They had no equal up until maybe now. Maybe things are going to change. Maybe things will push hard. And that's good because I think the people that made those movies, Carpenter, Toby Hooper, William Friedkin making The Exorcist, wanted that. I think they were a little depressed that nobody was pushing hard because they wanted to inspire people for sure. And I think they wanted people to be as grandiose, as strong, as flamboyant as they were with their work, and also technically inclined as they were. And so it's happening. I'm seeing it happen. I'm starting to see these little horror movies that are starting to impress me, and I really love that. And obviously, we're part of that as well. And so right there, you were bitten by the bug. And did you think about getting a Super 8mm camera at that time, or using one, or one of the early crude video cameras, or a 16mm camera? Did you think about that at all at that moment?
I want to answer that, and I will answer it, but I want to mention something before we get to that, just so we don't miss it. I think that the age of the VHS, when that came in, I think that had a huge impact on myself, and I'm sure you as well, because what it did was, unlike where we couldn't see movies at home, if you didn't miss it in the theater, if you miss it in the theater, or if you didn't have cable, which my family did not, what VHS allowed was those of us who had an interest in those movies, even the ones we had read about in Fangora or Cinefantastique that we had not seen when it came out, like Toby Hooper's Chainsaw, we could actually seek those out at a video store. And I remember going to get Chainsaw fairly early in one of the first couple of movies I saw. And I watched it with a girl I was dating at the time. And the thing that I'll never forget about that particular movie was when we watched it, I remember the videotape, not literally, but what was on it actually felt dangerous. It felt like that movie was so powerful that the tape could not contain it. I don't mean that in a sense of a ghost or whatever, but it was so potent that I actually felt that we had just seen was kind of dangerous for us because it's like he broke that fourth wall. Toby just crashed into it with Leatherface and those people out in the hot Texas sun, and it was like more than a movie.
Right.
And that was like, so it's like a work of art because it was not just actors acting. It seemed like I was watching reality. But to answer your question, my family didn't have enough money for cameras and stuff like that. So the first time I got involved with any sort of movie related equipment was in my high school. They had a class called TV productions, and it was with videotape. And obviously, you couldn't just get the camera yourself. They would split the class up into like two, and like half the class would make a film, and the other half would make a film. Now, I could never take credit as making like my own film out of that, but I can tell you I was pretty inspirational in kind of directionalizing the group I was with to tell the story that we were going to make. But I can't say it was my own film. Um, so I also remember, Chris. I think this is important for maybe there's somebody out there that's never made a film that doesn't know what it takes to learn it. I could tell you when I first started thinking, what do I have to know as a director? I felt completely overwhelmed. I remember thinking, how could I possibly learn all the aspects that go into directing? Because what I did know was that they work with every single department. That means you have to have an understanding of acting, editing, sound, music composition, all that stuff, cameras, shots. So I remember just thinking, how the hell am I going to learn all that? I remember I was kind of off put by it. Felt like a bunch of weight on my shoulders. And at the time, with no internet, no phones, no computers, the only way to learn was books. And I remember I just went to the mall and I'm like, okay, what book am I going to take? And I didn't really have one that gave me all the answers, but I just started to read about it. And I'm a voracious reader. I read a lot to this day. I read a lot. And I just started reading. And I would say it was almost 4 years before I made my first film myself, which was when I was in the Army in Germany in 1986.
So, I remember back then there were little things, and I hadn't gone to film school until the 90s, but back then, John Russo did have a how-to film book. Sidney Lumet had a book about making movies, and I got my hands on those as well. Um, little by little, there were things that came out that really helped. And there were articles in Fangoria magazine that helped, or Cinefantastique, and all of these things lent to that. There were special effects makeup documentaries like Fangoria Screen Grades Volume 1 about Tom Savini. All those things lent to movie making of the people like us at that time. And so you went to the Army after you took this course, after you experimented, you started reading. Can you tell me about what, if you don't mind, can you tell me why you decided to join the Army and where your head was at the time? And were you carrying the dream of being a movie maker with you always?
Yeah, the answer to all that is absolutely yes. In fact, the reason I went in is because I came from a family that didn't have a lot of money. I wanted to go to film school. And I knew that the three biggest places at that time were USC, UCLA, or NYU. And because I was on the West Coast, I was going to aim for USC or UCLA. So my family didn't have the money to put me through school. So I either had to work and go to school, or at that time, my other option was military because you could get the college fund. And what I thought about was since I didn't have my family didn't have a lot of money either, we couldn't really travel much as a kid. So I thought, you know what? Let me knock two birds with one stone. Let me join the military. I also felt that I felt truly that I wanted to be able to say I stood up for our country, that I did my part to ensure our freedom, whether there's a war or not. Obviously, I didn't hope for one, but I wanted to be able to be the first one in my family that went in the military voluntarily, and then I went in for the college fund to go to film school. I actually tried to get the film making MOS, which was making movies for the military, but it was actually not open at that time, so I couldn't get it. So I thought about, well, what's a job that I could learn a skill and a trade for that I could use in the outside world? And I thought about like an office where I could be an executive assistant or an office manager. So that was the job I ended up choosing. And they said, well, we're going to let you choose where you want to go too. Where would you like to go? And they said you could either go to Korea or you could go to Europe. And I thought, you know what? Let me go to Europe. So I'd never been out of the country with my family situation. So they ended up giving me a duty station in Kaiserslautern, at the time West Germany, because they were separated. And I spent my first 2 years in Kaiserslautern. I took my basic training, Fort Jackson, South Carolina, in the old World War II barracks on Tank Hill, which is a pretty tough unit to be in. And then my AIT, which is your job, I went to Fort Ben Harrison, Indiana, which a lot of guys were jealous of because that was the Army financial headquarters. So that's like office environment. And it was 10 women for every man. So they were jealous that I'd be around all these girls, but that's not the reason why I went there, obviously. And my last duty station was Fort Polk, Louisiana. So that was my 4 years active Army. And I did a year and a half in the reserves in Hempstead, New York, and Long Island.
And during that time, do you feel, because you have all these things shaping you through your timeline, you have movies, you have some supernatural experiences, I would attest to that, or at least you're dipping your toe into the unknown with some of those things that happen in the woods. And now you get into the military. It's like a life shapes an artist. That artist then takes bits and even sometimes subconsciously takes bits of their experience and puts it into story, puts it into life. What happened in the Army, coupled with what happened before it, that I think eventually shaped you as an artist and you started putting all of the above into your work? Did anything, or should I say, and let me restate that. So did anything happen in the Army that added to that shaping of your artistic personality?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think one of the things that probably no one would ever mention, but was very real to me, was I look at back at my armies. It was one of the best things I ever did in my life. I don't regret it. I'm very proud of it. Um, I've got my health insurance through military, all that stuff. So it was definitely worth it. Um, One of the things I'd mentioned that probably I've never heard anyone mention, I think maybe I'll be the first, is when you're in an environment where you're quote unquote kind of controlled a little bit, where you don't have your freedom every moment. What that does is when you can have your freedom, I think you really value that time. So when I did my 4 years, I could have re-enlisted. I would have got a bonus. I could have went up in rank. And it wasn't because I didn't appreciate it or see the value to it, but I knew I wanted to be a film director. And to stay in would have, slowed that down, maybe even prevented that. So that was not going to happen. But I think that because I went through the experience of time where you have to kind of follow orders and do what people above you are asking, I really take the time that I have for myself and to really utilize it. I don't just blow it and waste it. You take advantage of it. And that's why I'm able to make so many things happen in such a short time, is because it made me very disciplined, both what I learned military wise, but also because I learned when you've got the time to yourself, use it. So yeah, but as far as some situations, I remember basic training. There was a time was really we were doing a field test out in the field in the woods, and I remember seeing this guy about, I don't know, 100 yards away through a bunch of trees. He had taken his M16, pulled off the strap, tied it around his neck, and tied it on a tree, and he was actually hanging from the tree. So I guess the pressure of basic training, which is pretty immense, you can't see your family, you can't talk to friends, you're waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning, you're being forced to go to bed at 9 or 10 o'clock at night, you have to stay up on guard duty, you've got to do thousands of push-ups and sit-ups, run 2 miles every day, be verbally abused. I mean, all that stuff that they do to you in the military to tear you down so that they can build you up, that can get to a lot of guys. And they actually say that at some point, almost everybody will be broken, either mentally or physically. With this guy, I think it was mentally. He was so overcome that he tried to kill himself. And when I saw this guy hanging, everybody rushed out to save him, and they rescued him. But he ended up getting his rank pulled back, reduced to E1, and he had to retake basic training over.
Wow. And did that shock you to see that?
It did. And the other thing that I think that shocked me was I actually got a chance to experience what some people believe was not real, which was the grease pit. I had a situation where the first day of basic training, after they cut all your hair off and they signed you to a unit, you're with all these strangers, different parts of the country, different nationalities. You don't have no idea who these guys are. Some of them are going to like you. Some of them are not going to like you, but you're going to live together and you have to team up. And I remember the first day they said, we're going to do KP reverse alphabet. And because my last name's with a W, I got KP the first day. So to get up at time for KP, you had to get up like 4:30. So I asked my fire guard that night, would he wake me up? Because you don't have alarm clocks. And he said he would, but he ended up falling asleep. So I got to KP about a half hour late, and that's not good on first day. And I certainly didn't understand the structure of rank and how you talk to certain people. And so I come into this KP, the last guy getting there. They certainly were not happy about that. So they're like, why the hell are you late? And I said, my fire guard fell asleep. He didn't wake up. We don't give a shit about that. Give me 20. So you have to drop and give push-ups. That was not such a big deal. I was very conditioned for that. But when I got up, I said, sorry, sir. He goes, drop, give me 20 again. It was like I had done something wrong. And I didn't know what I'd done wrong. And I get up after doing them and said, I'm sorry, sir. Drop, give me 20 again. And that happened like 4 or 5 times. And I didn't understand what it was I was doing wrong. Well, when you are enlisted, meaning private, PFC, private 2, corporal, sergeant, sergeant major, all that, staff sergeant, that's what they call enlisted. If you're an officer, they like to be called sir. If you're enlisted, don't ever call them sir, because they say they work for a living, not like the officers. So I kept calling him sir, and he was a sergeant. So every time I dropped it was because I was saying the wrong thing. But anyway, to get to the story real quick, maybe a couple hours later, this guy kept talking to me in KP. And the sergeant said, would you guys stop talking? You're not supposed to be talking. So this guy kept asking questions. And one time I answered him and he said, that's it. You guys are going in the grease pit. So for those of you that don't think this is real, I'm about to tell you the reality of this. So what the grease pit is, it's a hole in the ground right outside the kitchen that faces where all the units come to have breakfast, lunch, dinner. They line up to see the poor, stupid souls that get assigned to this task. And what we had to do was we had to take a rake and dig into this black purple pit of liquid that's sitting in South Carolina August heat, because that's when I was there at basic training. So 90, 100 degrees. You have bees flying around, spiders, ants. You have to dredge up all the garbage on the bottom of this liquid, take a teaspoon, drain the liquid, and fill an entire steel garbage can. And the sergeant said when he comes back at the end of the day, If there's too much liquid, you will restart and do it again the next day. So I was very careful. And as you're doing it, people are coming up all these units because you have 20, 30, 40 units. And believe me when I say this, they make fun of you. Look at that motherfucker over. Look at that asshole, that dumb shit. And they're calling you every name you can imagine. Every one of the sergeants, every one of the soldiers are laughing at you. You're being made fun of. So I had to do that for an entire day in the heat with those bees and everything. And I ended up filling like 2/3 of it, or maybe a third. And because I didn't have much liquid, he said I was okay. But one of the guys that when I was talking to, that guy, he didn't do it. He had too much liquid. They made him restart. He actually jumped in feet first because he said he wasn't going to use the spoon, and he started using his hands to drain the water out. And his skin turned black and purple. It stained it, and he smelled like crap for weeks. I can't believe he did that. But that's two of my Army experiences.
So that, the grease pit thing, just to clarify, was a legend that a lot of people denied it was even real, but you experienced it yourself.
Yeah, I've told people that does not exist. I said, no, it's real.
After these messages, we'll be right back.
In 1968, George Romero brought us Night of the Living Dead. It became the classic horror film of its time. Now, George Romero brings us the most intensely shocking motion picture experience for all times. Dawn of the Dead contains scenes of violence that may be considered shocking. No one under 17 will be admitted. From United Film Distributing Company.
100,000 years ago, it came to our galaxy. Trapped in the wasteland of Antarctica, it could not escape. Now, it is free to become one of us. John Carpenter's The Thing, rated R.
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
And so let me ask, before we move on from your Army experience, and there's some interesting things that happened. Was there ever something so dangerous that happened that scared you there, or any kind of anomaly or anything strange at all that happened outside of the two experiences you just talked about?
Well, there was two when I was living back in the housing development in 21 Oaks that I didn't mention that I think shaped me as a man, as a protector, as a father, and partially probably as a movie maker trying to create a reality of tension. And that was where my mom and I would stay up very late at night in that house, especially in 21 Oaks, because I was at that age, 13, 14. And I remember one night we were talking, and my other brothers and sisters were asleep, and we were in the kitchen, and we heard this big bang. And my mom said, "What was that?" And I said, "I don't know what that was." It wasn't a gunshot. It sounded like some sort of physical bang. And I I couldn't identify it exactly. And it was actually a stormy night that night. And so we thought maybe it could have been a storm, maybe something like that. So we didn't really pay much mind to it. Well, half hour later, when I go to bed, maybe around midnight, I'm walking down the hallway. Now, because I'm the oldest of all those kids, I was also the captain of my soccer team. I've always been kind of in a leadership role, which really goes well with being a film director. Um, I I'm very observant of everything, not in a paranoid way, but I watch what's around me. I listen. And I noticed I was walking down the hallway that my door was shut and I had not left it shut. And I had a brother who was in a bunk bed with me asleep in that room. And I could see the light was on. So I did not leave the light on and I did not have the door shut. So these little alarm bells started to go off. Not so much I was like scared out of my mind, but I was put on alert. I didn't say anything to my mom. I go walk into my room and the door was not all the way closed. It was just kind of ajar. And I start to push it open and what I saw was muddy footprints tracked into the room from the window that was open with the curtain blowing into the room because it had been a storm and it's still windy. So a guy, we found out later, had pushed our picnic table up against the house. That must have been the bane. Or when he jumped into the room, my brother never actually woke up. He's a hard sleeper. And this guy must have walked enough into my room where I saw the footsteps kind of go to the edge of the door. And he must have heard us talking in the kitchen. And then he must have went out. And after we had that happen, my dad the next day had said to me, well, I think that what he wants is he probably wants to go in our garage. I grew up with a father who was a big time drag racer. He was not a big time in terms of winning on an NHRA level, but he was a drag racing freak. My dad's whole life was all about engines, motors, welding, he had a 392 Hemi and a 39 Chevy with the fenders taken off. It was yellow with pearl flames. He ran in what was called the Alder class, which eventually got outlawed. They ran about 180 miles an hour in the late 70s. And as a boy, my dad took me drag racing almost every single weekend. So I grew up around funny cars, top fuel dragsters, Ed the Ace McCullough, Don the Snake Perdome, Tom the Mongoose McEwen, Big Daddy Don Garland. That was my childhood. So my dad thought that someone wants to come in, steal his tools, maybe steal his car. So he says, you need to be the man of the house so that you protect the family if that was to happen. And about a week after that time with me and my mom, it was around the same time of night, my mom said, there's someone outside the house. They're running towards the front of the house. Now, I had a BB gun that I was sleeping with the whole week after that happened the first time because the guy had come into my room. That was me and my brother's room. So I was sleeping with a BB gun. So when my mom said the guy's running towards the house, the reason why I'm telling you this story is some people might not have done anything. They might have stayed in the house, kept the doors locked, not faced it. I felt as the oldest of the house, the man of the house, quote unquote, I had to do something. So I grabbed my pellet BB gun. I grabbed it, ran to the front door, opened it up, ran out into the front yard, and I aimed the gun at this guy running. I had it right on him. And I was a very good shot. And the guy looked back and he saw me pointing a gun at him. Now, this particular pellet gun had a pump, so it kind of looks like a shotgun. Remember, I grew up around guns as a kid liking that stuff. So as the guy's looking at the gun, so I had to think in very quick terms. Do I shoot the gun and he hears it's a pellet gun, it's not a real rifle, and maybe he turns around and comes back? Maybe he's got a weapon. If I miss, I break a car window to one of the cars close by. So I made a decision not to pull the trigger. And he kept running. He never stopped and he never came back. So I think that situation where I protected my family, kind of protected our home and did something without hurting the guy shaped me a lot as well. And there's one more story and I'll make it shorter. There was another time where me and my friends were out in those woods we've already talked about, but we were much further out in the Poker Run. We came across a guy in a bulldozer, and I don't know what he was doing. We weren't that close, but he must have been doing something that was bad. I don't know if he's doing drugs. I don't know if he had money. I don't know if he's having sex. We couldn't tell. This guy got in that bulldozer, and he literally chased me and my friend all the way back to the housing development. He never quite got to us. We were pretty fast runners. I was a soccer player. I was the team captain of my soccer team, so I could run. And my friend was pretty athletic. He was a little older than me. He did not get to us, but that was crazy. We don't even know why. A guy in a bulldozer chased us back to the house development. So those were that with the coyotes. Those were situations that shaped me as a man, as a father, as a protector. I don't usually run away from things. I will try to face them as intelligently and safely as I can.
Would you say that any of those singular experiences were already or are to be adapted into a motion picture for you, like directly? Are any of those experiences something that you wrote into a story?
Yeah, I have a script called Sasquatch that's all about me growing up as a 13-year-old boy with a large family in a housing development by woods and having exactly what happened to my family and friends. And then I fictionally created it from there to tell a story about a boy who grows up loving horror films, that makes a horror film fanzine as a boy, which I did with a magazine called Carnage back when I was in high school. I recruited artists and writers and myself, and we reviewed horror films and wrote short stories and created grotesque artwork that we created back when I was in high school. But the only one I've really used the real situation was Sasquatch, and that's a movie that I intend to make very soon. It's a bigger movie than the one I'm making now, obviously, and my movie Anomaly, but it's probably the third movie in line, unless I get a situation where I can make it sooner than that. But that's autobiographical, and I took it to one of the biggest renowned Bigfoot experts in the world, Cliff Crook. I wanted to get his opinion on it, and he said it's the best thing ever written about Bigfoot he's ever seen. And I was very honored by that, but it is based on reality.
The thing is, and that's forthcoming. That's probably what you're going to make after whatever what you're about to make. But let's get to the very first motion picture that you made. When was the first honest attempt at making something that you wanted to bring out to people? You wanted people to see it. What was that first film?
Well, the first thing I started doing was, just to be honest with you, was I was taking songs from heavy metal bands that I liked in the mid 80s, meaning 86. I took a song from a band called Pantera. This is before the Pantera everyone knows now. It did not have the same singer, Phil Anselmo. They had a totally different singer, and they were more like Rat and Van Halen. So Dimebag was actually called Diamond Daryl, not Dimebag Daryl. And I took a song called Come On Eyes off their second album. Actually, it might have been the third because they made a couple albums, Pantera, back in the 80s. A friend of mine was pen pals with them and told me these two guys from Texas that were brothers were recording their studio. So I learned about Pantera in like 83. And so my first thing was a music video, not for them, not with a band, but I took the song and created a story to that song. I did the same thing to a band called Kraft, heavy metal band from Germany, Lita Ford, Lizzie Borden. I did Metallica. I did Malice. So my real training ground as a filmmaker was making amateur music videos for things I could never sell, but I was telling little movies, putting people that could act in them, and I edited together stories. My first film that I tried to create, I say tried because I didn't entirely succeed, was a film called Timber Quest. And it was a movie about a bunch of, at the time, they were soldiers in the military. That's who I recruited, playing actors. They got recruited by this rich guy to go on a scavenger hunt out in the woods, but he wanted to kill them when they were out in the woods. It was really more of an action film than a horror film, but it had a little bit of horror elements. We shot about 8 minutes of that, so we never finished it. But that was my first attempt. And then I attempted to make a feature film about a year or two later in Oklahoma with my friend Jay Bullbear. We tried to make a 194-page script, which is insane. I didn't know that then. We tried to do a 194-page script called Perishing Hearts in 2 weeks, which is impossible, in my opinion. And we tried it. And I cast local actors from high schools outside of Fort Polk, Louisiana. So at the time, that was high schools in DeRidder and Lake Charles. And I bought a brand new car just to drive these kids to go make this movie at my friend's house in Homily, Oklahoma, with some of his brothers and friends that we had in Oklahoma in 2 weeks' time. It was very ambitious. And I guess after about shooting 30 hours straight, which we did, I knew we were not going to pull it off and we were going to fail. And one of my actors had a nervous breakdown, and I knew we were too inexperienced. The script was too long. We were too ambitious. My DP passed out from exhaustion. I had him on the hood of a car going 60 miles an hour on the road. I had him climb a tree, go in a stream for shots. I mean, we were doing crazy stuff. And I decided that I had to pivot because we were not going to pull off the movie. And what I did instead was I decided to take a George Winston song, the New Age artist George Winston, the piano player who's one of my favorite artists of all time, who died not too long ago. Take one of his songs, tell a music video to that song, and with the actors that were still could do something like that. The one girl was fried. She was done. And that's what we did so we could walk away with something that was positive.
Now, it's those things that you're faced with because you have these dreams. And what usually when it begins, you really don't know how to make a movie. You really learn how to make a movie by doing it. And that takes time. And I think people who have never tried, regardless of what the technology is today, even, they have everything at their fingertips today. And you see I don't want to insult anybody, but you see the crappiest, they're just making like YouTube influencer videos instead of trying to make a movie, which I would say technologically, it's a lot easier for them now. Back then, we didn't have that. What were you shooting on when you shot your first movie?
We were shooting on VHS.
Right. And so you actually had to put a VHS tape in a camcorder. And was there any kind of editing program, or did you have to actually use the camcorder itself and try to edit with it?
We had to try to use like 2 VHS machines hooked up with the camera to make our edits. So, like you said, Chris, the filmmakers today have no idea how much easier they have it than we did back then. Because also you didn't have your do-it-yourself, steady trackers and lights that were portable, the LED.
That's all recent. That's recent.
Yeah, I remember taking car batteries and hooking up to car lights to light our scenes. So we were so crude, but we learned so much by doing it. Nobody was showing us how to do it. We were doing it on our own as much as we had learned from Fangora and Cinefantastique and all the other stuff and the movies we had seen. So yeah, we were doing the best we could with what we had. But I'll tell you what, you learn very quickly when it happens.
Sure. And you have to improve and you have to be honest. What was the first movie that you made that you would say had a genuine audience outside of family and friends?
I think you would probably have to go to, like 9 or 10 years later. I had made a short horror film called Madam Red, which was pretty ambitious. Guys cheating on their girlfriends and the girlfriends being in hell, getting revenge on the guys who cheated and brutally like just ripping their legs off. And that was the first one. Then we did a movie called Double Fantasy, which had 3 girls telling one was a scary story, one was like a Beauty and the Beast story, one was kind of a sexy hot story. Then I did my first feature, which was called, so I guess that was the one that was really for the audience. It was not a horror film. It was called Out of Touch, and it was a 132-minute drama. Had a little bit of horrific elements to it. It was really about a bunch of friends overcoming their shyness with each other. One girl was a drug addict. The villain of the movie was a female drug dealer who was gay. So she was preying on the girls in the movie. This is way before the stuff you see now with LGBT and all that. We're talking, this is 1988, 89, 90. So we were doing a movie like that. It took us 45 shooting days, over a year, and I cast actors from an acting studio I went to school at in Manhattan called HB Studios, Herbert Berghoff Studios. So these were all real actors, and we got 45 shooting days to do that film.
So here's what I'm looking to find out. When you're doing that, now, this is the challenge of the independent and the struggle of the independent filmmaker, because you're going in with an honest dream that's literally born when you're a child. So it's sacred. It's a sacred thing. And now you're faced with this enormous, for many people, insurmountable obstacle. So how does, from your perspective, I know from mine, and we probably share, a common denominator, all filmmakers do. But how is it that when you get there, how do you say, I need to make something that's worth it? And how does a movie maker assure that? How do you face that obstacle? What do you do? How do you be honest with yourself about it? What do you do?
Well, I think that all those mistakes that I made, if you want to call them failures, shaped me to become a better filmmaker, to write better, to cast better, to plan better. I don't know if some of the filmmakers today get that same chance, especially on a big level. Martin Scorsese was fired from his first film. Jim Cameron was fired from his first directing film, Piranha 2. So it's kind of like directors need that chance to learn. And I think it's really important that they go through that. So I think that, to answer your question, I think you're always ambitious and you're always trying your best to do well. But if you don't get that chance to kind of learn it, I think you're still going to make those mistakes to a degree. But over the course of the long time that I learned my craft, I think I was able to, hone in, sharpen my pencil, so to speak, so that I could make films on a better level so an audience would appreciate them more. But I think they probably appreciated the ambition. I just don't know if the skill was sharpened at first to be as good as it became later
I
on.
do
You know
know
what I
what
mean?
you mean. And again, I don't want to talk too much about myself. I want to talk about, you know, you referred to other movie makers. Well, it's very true that the ones that are known in film history as the greatest had to make a few films that weren't great first. A lot of them did. I mean, like, excluding Orson Welles, but you have to owe a lot to Greg Toland and his crew for Citizen Kane. Wells was not a cinematographer. He worked with filmmakers to make. He was a brilliant man, but he worked with filmmakers. So everyone from John Carpenter to David Lynch to Brian De Palma, even, had to make a few movies that most people don't even know about. De Palma made more than several features before he made anything that anyone knows about, and they weren't that great. They there was there. You could see De Palma in them, but his style didn't form much like Stanley Kubrick's until later. It took time. It took time. It really took time to actually form. And so I'm a firm believer that movie making, for the most part, is an older man's game, or older person. Because it takes time to be said. And I'm not the only one that said this. Oliver Stone has said that many times. He doesn't even believe a movie maker is worth it until they're in their 30s. Because you have to learn, you have to have life experience going in to make a good movie. I mean, you can make a goofball imitation of, you know, Evil Dead 3, which is Army of Darkness, and that's what you were inspired by, and then you make a watered down version of that. But that's not what I'm talking about. Because movie makers should be innovative. You should definitely be inspired. We can't avoid that as filmmakers, but you should be innovative. Your execution should be original. And the other thing is, you have to be a little crazy. In other words, what I was asking earlier about this insurmountable thing, you have to believe that you can surmount it, correct?
Yeah, yeah. I remember a friend of mine did a movie and in Seattle called Father Rock, and he had said to me, we were talking after he had made it, And I asked him, I said, how do you feel about looking back on your experience? Because it took him a while to make it. I'm sure you understand. And he said, if I would have known what it was going to take to pull it off, I probably would have never started. But because I didn't know, I went ahead and did it. And I think obviously after he had the experience, he was happy he did it. But he said if most people knew all the challenges they were going to face, the rejection, the lack of time, the not enough money, people not showing up when they show, whatever the case may be, he just said that it's almost like that naiveness and innocence worked in the favor of actually going through it. Then if he would have known what he'd have to do, he might not have even taken the chance of doing it. So I think that's probably true. It's almost like we got to go in with as much knowledge as we have, but kind of have blinders and just go all the way to the end until it's done. But yeah, I agree with you, Chris. You've got to have you've got to have high goals, but I think to be a really good filmmaker, you've got to have life experience because if everybody's just making the next copycat Spielberg film or J.J. Abrams film or whatever it may be, that's not that interesting as if it was something like Lynch made or Toby made or Bob Clark made. Those are much more like Porky's. Porky's is basically Bob Clark's life story growing up in high school. And when you watch that movie, it so feels so great and real because a lot of it was in his
Sure,
case.
well, of
You know what I
course.
mean?
Well, one of your ambitions as a movie maker should be to develop a unique voice. It's definitely something that should be on your list. Um, I like people complain about movie makers. Let's say about like Dario Argento, and they say, "Well, he was heavily influenced by Hitchcock, and he really has some nice shots, but the rest is junk." I disagree. I think everybody has their own way, and something beautiful about movie making to me, from the so-called worst filmmakers to the best, is that even the grungier filmmakers capture something unique in the time and place that it's made, and very unique to them. And I love many types of movies. The ones I hate the most are the ones that are being shoved at me, that are made by committee, that have $500 million put into it, and I feel like falling asleep after 3 minutes of watching. But sometimes I get exhilarated by a so-called Z-grade movie made by an artisan out in the middle of nowhere with amateur actors and not the greatest approach, but still there's something unique about it. Something, and I think in the drive-in era, do you agree that a lot of those movies in the drive-in era were like that? They weren't perfect, but there was something about them that you could never repeat again, something very authentic.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think that when you watch some of the movies today that are politically correct, whitewashed characters. Everything has, it's almost like they have a checklist. We have your transsexual, your transgender, your LGBT, your Asian actor, your black actor, your white with black, your black with white. You put it's so forced on us and it's so cliche and it's so predictable. If you're going to include all that stuff naturally, that is so much better than having that checklist that the corporate board meeting puts in front of the filmmaker. So I also like when I see a movie that was made from some unique place that they didn't have a lot of money. And I always ask myself, how the hell they pull that off? That is so admirable. It's so cool. And seeing like a different place in the background. I don't always want to just see LA or just New York and LA. I like to see off the cuff in Canada, Alaska, wherever it may be. Those are the things that really grab me. And I appreciate them so much more because I know they didn't have it easy to get it. And it gives them a unique voice in terms of maybe the director and the place they shot it. Those things play huge in my interest in films.
And that's part of why certain movies are great. That's the greatness about them, that authenticity, that unique handmade feel to it, how it is rough around the edges. And then I equally appreciate some incredibly made movies by filmmakers that work with, the high millions. So I think to love movies, you have to love a variety and you have to have an eclectic taste. And I do disregard anything that's forced anyone trying to force an agenda on me with a film. I have no interest. It's there somewhere in the shelves of film history just to refer to, but a lot of them I won't watch. And another question I wanted to ask you about today is that I have a hard time with a lot of these series that go on for like 8 seasons. I don't think I'll ever watch any of them. Motion pictures are where it's at. Even if a movie's 2 or 3 hours long, I'll still commit to it. But I don't think I can watch. There are very few series that I'll ever be able to watch, and you'll never be able to watch them again, essentially. But movies you can watch, 20 times a year if you really wanted to, or more. How do you feel about these series? I think they might wean off eventually, and movies will be on top again.
Yeah, I'm of the same opinion as you because I'm more of a film watcher than a TV watcher. The only thing that I watch really a lot of is true crime because my wife and I enjoy watching it. Not because we want to see people get raped and pillaged and attacked. That's not why. The reason why I enjoy watching is because it lets me see reality. I don't want to always live in a fictional world because I create fiction, but it gives me a chance to learn what that feels like and what it looks like, sounds like. But yeah, I don't watch a lot of TV series. I love movies, and I especially love older movies, meaning not necessarily from what's coming out in the theater this week, but you know 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, because I see a different level of skill on every level: cinematographer, music, script, actors. I hate to try to insult anybody, but now that, like you said, Chris, we are seeing some unique voices that aren't coming from just the corporate side, like The Witch, Hereditary, movies like that that are very, very unique and have a voice from a person that has something to say. Those are Midsummer. Those are films that are very unique. They're powerful, and they remind me a lot of the times with our heroes like Cronenberg and Carpenter and Romero. I'm seeing a renaissance that way, and it's probably these guys like us that grew up on the guys we like.
I believe that, and on top of that, because I think they get it. I think they get how the movies were made and what was much deeper than just the surface level stuff. And then, of course, you have to understand the language of cinema to be able to translate that through your imagination and make it into a movie. So, there's so much to try and understand here and in a short period of time. But what I really wanted to get to the heart of was that irresistible compulsion. I know you know what I'm talking about. That drives you through this no matter what. Can you give me an example of that in your life? No matter what, no matter how hard it is, no matter what the reaction is from anyone. And again, this has happened to some of the greatest filmmakers. Look at William Friedkin making, The French Connection and The Exorcist on a high. And then he makes Sorcerer, which is an absolute masterpiece. But it gets rejected, it gets ignored. People are like, yeah, so what? That was the reaction to it when it came out. And it crushed him inside as an artist, like killed him inside. Um, how does an artist prepare for something like that? How do you deal with something like that? Because a movie, even if it's a bad movie, requires everything from the maker.
Yeah, it's a really potent question you're asking. I think the same thing happened to John Carpenter with The Thing. I think he was crushed by the initial audience reaction, and especially the dim-witted critics that just blasted it. I remember in the paper where town I lived in, they compared it to a pornographic movie with gore. They said it's like watching an X-rated gore film, and I didn't see that when I saw it. I thought I saw a masterpiece. I think that you know I had a movie come out a couple years ago called Devil's Five, and it took us 4 years to make that film. It had 5 movies put together as one anthology. We put everything we had into it. We were way underfunded based on the budgets we really needed, but we somehow put together car chases, heads getting ripped off, demon possession, all this other stuff in the woods in a church. We shot in a church with Satanists, No church would allow that, but yet we pulled it off. And I remember the first day it came out, I'm so excited. 4 years to make it, 2 years to find a distributor. It gets released. And on the first day, the first review I see says worst movie of the year. And I'm thinking, how could the guy say that? I've seen so much more crap than this movie. And this guy says, worst movie of the year. I don't know if you remember this call, Chris, but I remember calling you up. I wasn't crying about it, but I mentioned to you that I saw these nasty online reviews and it really brought me down because I'd done so much to make the film, to make it happen, and to get that kind of response. And you said to me something that was very important. You said, do not read the reviews. Don't pay attention to them. Just keep doing what you're doing. That's what really matters. And I took your advice and I've pretty much done that ever since. So I think to answer your question is I don't try to pay attention to the naysayers. They're going to criticize everybody and you can't
That's
please everyone.
true. And you can choose any movie in the catalog of over 100 years. Uh, and they have their naysay. Every single movie that we might think is great has a naysayer saying, well, so what? But those voices that speak out like that against things, they're those people, we ever really see their personalities? I imagine, and this is for fun. But imagine, if you will, a group of movie makers that got together and started reviewing reviewers. Like, let's just go through and talk about how their last review was and what their personalities are like and why they're very lazy. And imagine if they were held up in that sense. I don't know if they would get fired up about it or they would crumble. But we're movie makers. And the thing is, we don't do stuff like that. We're interested in creating. And the reason why I said what I said to you is because no matter what, no matter how good you do, there's gonna be somebody, for whatever reason, whether it be personal, not personal, the person's lazy, they simply didn't like what you do. But a critic is a critic, and that's what they do. I mean, they enjoy either. I think a good film critic is not exactly a critic, but a historian, and they celebrate motion pictures and they want to tell you about why this movie's good or what's good about it. And the things that are bad, you kind of just avoid, like you could simply say, I'm sorry, I'm just not interested. But the critic, in the sense that slams a motion picture, is a completely different animal. And that says a lot more about them than it says about the movie. They can give any reason to justify their mouth, but I can tell you at the end of the day, they're not the greatest of people.
Yeah. And the other thing I'd say to you, Chris, is are any of these people we're talking about even legitimately qualified critics? What makes them know what they know? How much experience do they have watching films? Have they ever made a movie? Have they ever attempted to make a movie? What gives them the power or the right or the authority to say what they do? I remember when I was talking to Bob Clark, thank God I got a chance to talk to him before his untimely death, because in my opinion, he was one of the most underrated and most highly diverse filmmakers of all time. Like, how many people made a Black Christmas and Porky's and a Christmas Story? Like, who could make that many different kinds of films? But I remember Bob told me on the phone one time, or should I say Mr. Clark, with respect, he said to me, well, as far as critics, he said, I don't really pay attention to them because critics need to be educated. They may not even like the type of movie you're making a film on. You don't know what their background is. So he says critics are usually not educated enough to even form an opinion about a movie. That was his opinion, and God knows he made a lot more films than I have so far.
Well, he was right about that. And the thing is, he didn't, I met Bob as well, before he died, and what a nice guy. But he didn't even experience. I don't think he got to experience the full blast of. Now, people like Leonard Maltin and Roger Ebert were both film historians. Now, everyone's a critic. They're reviewing it like they're reviewing food, a product online. And the reason why I say ignore it is that it's just too much of an open door. There are no requirements to come out and say something nasty at all. And you don't even know who these people are. This could be a guy that you took your film course with, and he's jealous that you're doing something that he can't or won't or doesn't have the guts to do. And of course, those are usually the people that come out and slam a piece of work. See, I'm different. I'm a movie maker, but I'm also somebody who just loves looking at artwork. And there are all kinds of artwork. You have everybody from Jean-Michel Basquiat to more raw, kinetic art, like, and it's criticized but also praised and sold for millions. Jackson Pollock, and so you have incredible illustrators like Frank Frazetta, in comparison to someone like Pollock, where people criticize Pollock's work and just say it's a bunch of streaky lines of paint. What the hell is this garbage? But it sold for millions, and he was hailed as a great artist. Who's to say, right? So I think the artist just makes art. And I'm an artist and I love art. People criticize Frank Zappa, but there are also the groups of people like myself that believe he's one of the greatest geniuses of music of all time, you know? And it's just going to be like that forever, man. So I think you have to be your harshest critic silently, secretly, and never stop kicking your own ass. I practice what I preach every day. So I do believe that. But outside of that, forget the rest. You should be harsh on yourself. It's silently in your own private church.
I agree with you, and I believe we're both on the same perspective on this. There was a period over the last 10, 15 years, online reviewers that just seem to bash horror. They seem to always take the stance of attacking it and tearing it down. And I think the opposite needs to be done. We need to build up, praise. I don't mean in a false way, but if someone's making a movie, again, I take a Devil's Five example because it's my own film, but I'm not trying to say people have to like it. But you see somebody that certainly had not enough money that makes this highly ambitious thing, gets it out, and you I would think that there would be some sort of people that would appreciate that versus just trying to knock it into the dirt. So I'd rather hear about people talking about films in a positive light rather than a negative light. So that whole period that I saw like this online kind of community, so to speak, that I lost complete interest in that. I want people that are going to want to work for like together. That's kind of the problem in our society is why separate ourselves? Why battle each other? Let's work together and let's do the best we can. And if we can do that friendly, oh my God, can you imagine how much better the world and the film world would be? So things like, you having me on your show like this, that's one of those things, an effort of that. By the way, I'm very honored that you have me on your show. I just want to say that so I don't forget to thank you because I know your show's been out for years. I listen to it, love it, and I appreciate what you do for the horror film world, for the filmmaking world, for the story world, for the radio world. You are one of the voices we need on in our world today, Chris. So I want you to know that, and I'm not just saying that because I'm on your
Oh, I
show.
appreciate that, Terry. I do. Again, it's important for people to have these discussions, to hear things. I try to come on here with no predetermined speech about what this needs to be outside of trying to dig deeper and hear great stories from a human being every single time, whether it be about the paranormal or filmmaking or music or whatever, I cover. That's all I'm trying to do. And I learn through the process. And again, as motion pictures go, sometimes they're made and appreciated later. Sometimes a movie maker can make several movies that, I just mentioned. I wasn't the biggest fan of Ty West. I liked his first film and kind of liked his House of the Devil, grew on me. But it wasn't until recently, his recent trilogy, that's just blowing me away. I think he's a solid movie maker, and that can change for anybody at any time. You can either be like Charles Lawton, make one movie and just blow everybody away and then drop the mic, essentially, or you can have a collection of films that are just, where Kubrick was making, uh, you know, let's say go back to Paths of Glory and Forthcoming, that just were knocking people dead, but the funny thing is, he made 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is one of the greatest movies ever made. I'm obviously not the only one that says it. Then Pauline Kael hailed film critic, called it the most expensive amateurish piece of garbage ever made. Yeah,
It's unbelievable.
yeah.
Unbelievable.
Called him an amateur. This was just the work of an amateur filmmaker. Horrible, garbage, boring. You know, it's an opinion. It really is just an opinion. And you had movie makers that are slammed, but they don't stop. And that's the thing that we share, all of us, is that irresistible compulsion. Where do you think that comes from? What is that? Was that born when you were a kid, when that magic from the motion pictures went into your soul, essentially, into your imagination, and never left? Because no matter what the struggle is, we keep doing it. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think if you catch it like obviously you did and I did, it goes so deep into your soul. I've said this, and I don't mean this in a negative light, but just in a factual, true light. I've sometimes say, is it a curse or is it a blessing? Because you could look at it both ways. Because I find myself, I could be at a wedding, and the wedding's great. You're listening to the pastor talking, seeing the two people, and your mind is thinking about the scene you want to film, or you're writing, or the movie you're going to make in 2 months. You're on a train, traveling down the road, you're at work, and it's like it never really leaves. Not that it's always on your mind, but when you're a filmmaker like we are, I believe it's just something that is so in depth into your heart and soul. Because the truth is, that's kind of what you need to be able to do it, because it's very hard work. It's not, I don't say that loosely, but literally, when you make a movie, there is no time like a job. It starts from the minute you wake up until the time you basically kind of exhaustedly go to sleep. Because if you direct a movie, I'm sure you've felt this, Chris. It takes everything you have out of you if you do it well or right, because you want to give all that to the film. You're always thinking about it. You're always thinking about the shot, the actor. Was it good? Do we have to redo it? Are we running out of time? What's the weather like? It's this constant battle of everything involved. And I think, just like you said, Chris, we saw these movies that hit us so deeply. We started making movies ourselves. We enjoyed maybe the response that someone gave to the movies. We felt like we had a talent at doing it. We had a talent at picking people to be in these movies, to work with. And I think there's a talent of leading people, how to work with people. My wife always said to me, I've had the gift of gab, that I can get people to do literally anything and that people will like doing it. It's not just taking advantage of people, but getting them to do their best. So I think it's like all these things kind of rolled up into one. It's weird because there's been times where, like, I remember in 2008, where I could not raise money if I tried for the movie I was trying to make at the time. And at one point, I thought, and that was during the recession, and I didn't know that like at the time, but I felt it, and I was like, should I keep doing this? I can't seem to get anything made. It's literally like I'm at a standstill, and I remember I was really upset. I felt totally frustrated, and my friend said to me, "You can't give up. You can't give up. You're too good at this. You got to keep going." And I did. And I remember shortly after that, I found out we were going to have a daughter, our first child, our only child, and she was one of the greatest things in our lives to this day. But I made a conscious decision to not direct anything for 5 years. That was a conscious choice because I felt those first 5 years, you would never get those back. And she was more important than the movies. I did not regret doing that. When I was getting time to go back to directing, I was talking to this friend, and I had been writing reviews because it kept my creativity going, writing DVD reviews, Blu-rays, movies, concerts, heavy metal albums, etc. And I remember I went to my friend and I said, I'm really feeling like a teeter-totter. The reviews are taking a lot of my time, but the movies kind of need my time as well. And he said to me, are you a filmmaker or are you a journalist? I think you need to make a decision. And I did. I picked filmmaking. Do you know, from that time, after not directing any movies, by choice, for 5 years, I made in 2014, that was in 2013. 2014, I made Stash. 2015, I made The Devil's Five Wraparound. 2016, I made Abandoned. 2017, I made Gruesome Threesome. 2018, I started making Double Vision. 2019, I made the rest of Double Vision. 2020, we had the pandemic. That took a couple years off. 2022, I did the trailer for Anomaly. Then I tried to raise money for that for 2 years and decided since I'm having trouble with that, I got to make a movie now. And so that leads us to the film I'm about to make next, which is called Beginning of the End. We're going to be shooting in 50 days. We have a crowd fund for that. And we're hoping that maybe some people listening might be interested. So that's where we got to this point.
So tell me, and again, this is 30 years that we tried to condense into 2 hours here. So for the audience listening, Terry has a long story, like all of us do, but he's been making movies for a very long time, and the journey is much more vast than I could put into 2 hours, but I'm doing my best. Um, Tell me about the story of this new film. And again, this is at a time now where you've been doing this for a long time, and we don't think about our age. That's something that needs to be very clear. It's not like, oh, wow, it's time to retire, Like, Ridley Scott is 90 years old almost, and he's making these incredible epics. I wouldn't recommend starting in your 50s because there's a lot to learn.
Yes.
But there's no stopping. We stop when we no longer can breathe anymore. That's what movie making is, for the real movie makers, and you are one. And so, tell me about this story, this film you're about to make.
So this story is called Beginning of the End, and the reason I'm calling it that is because in my story, which is the first of 4 films that will be another anthology, what I decided after not getting all the money for Anomaly, that it's easier to make a 20-minute movie than a 90 or 2-hour movie. So, and I felt if I pulled together with a couple filmmakers, we could release a feature film and have enough resources to make each one of our films. So I'm calling it Begin the End because I came up with the idea through a friend. I like to acknowledge that. I went to my friend David Lanson up in Massachusetts, who has helped finance a couple of my films, meaning Abandon, Double Vision, Gruesome Threesome. He put his money behind those films, which is amazing. He wasn't the only one, but he's the main guy, actually. And I went to him and I said, David, what's something that could make people kill each other? He goes, oh, AI. That's easy, AI. So what we've done is, in my new film, which I'm the executive producer because I created the idea and I recruited the other directors working with me on this film, we basically are taking AI as the main threat and telling 4 different stories verging off AI. So they're not really about computers, but they're about how AI could use different things to make you get violent. Cell phones, text, smart home, smart car, social media, deep fakes, X-rated movies being changing the faces of people having sex are not the same 2 people, or should I say like a sex film, maybe not X-rated. So our movies are going to be in that vein. And this particular movie that I'm working on now on Indiegogo is about a family that has a home invasion that becomes a siege movie. And I was inspired by trying to capture the feel of Tobe Hooper's Chainsaw mixed with Wes Craven's first film, Last House on the Left. They're both very comparable, meaning realistic, brutal, unrelenting horror. And then I wanted to take Orson Welles' War of the Worlds radio broadcast from the late 30s, which of course I wasn't alive during, but I heard it created a panic on a mass level. And I wanted to try to do that with my storyline and then make it look and feel at times like a John Carpenter siege movie. So that's what my movie's going to be. We're shooting anamorphic like John Carpenter. We are making it brutal like Chainsaw and Last House. And it's going to be something that you could not predict. It's not cliched. We're going to flip the story quite a few times, and the characters are not stock. They are not cliched, and you will have no idea what's going to happen. For 20 minutes, I'm going to take you on a roller coaster like the films I mentioned.
The passion that builds with every new picture, especially when you've been independent your whole life. Because I could see a movie maker getting lazy. Let's say they're getting rich off of one or two movies and have never experienced that type of wealth or attention before, and perhaps their passion is extinguished. However, a movie maker that's been fighting, that's been hungry their entire life, and fighting for a vision and fighting for and fighting with and this compulsion is driving them, does not understand to relent, does not understand that it's time to retire. So would you say this movie you're about to make is is all of your passion, more than ever going into it? Could you say that, or is it? Do you feel like you're settling down? Do you feel like your passion's on fire more than ever?
Yeah, I would say that that is true, and I would say it's the most ambitious movie I've ever done at this point, and I would also say it's the most prepared I have ever been for a film ever. I have every shot not just figured out, which most directors do, but I'm talking down to the lens length. We know every one of the 75 shots down to 35 anamorphic, 50 anamorphic, 75 anamorphic. It is all there in not only the shooting script, it's also been annotated in the shooting schedule, and it's also been annotated in our storyboards. And this is the first movie I've ever had storyboarded. So I've gone to the greatest degree I've ever gone to prepare for this movie, and we're talking it's about 50 days away from shooting. So I'm not relaxing. I'm not taking any soft road. I'm going all guns blazing for this thing to kick ass, and it's the most brutal film I've ever made to this point.
And it's an interesting time too, because in the past there wasn't a way to make motion pictures through crowdsourced funding. And I think it's interesting because people can participate. They can essentially be producers, and I'm not plugging anything right now. I just think that's an interesting thing. I haven't really done it. I think I made an attempt with one project, and then I had to answer the calling to go to History Channel and go make a special. But um, I think it's an interesting thing that collectively people can get together and want to see your picture get made. This is a good time for a story like that. I spoke to you about it, and I've always been a supporter of you, but I felt like, you know, it's important that maybe, and I do talk about the struggles of independent movie making. I've talked about them for a long time now. That I felt like it was interesting to hear more about your life, because movie makers sometimes get so caught up in trying to get people to pay attention to what they're doing that I think that people never really hear their story, and that's what was important to me tonight. I wanted to hear more of your story.
Absolutely. And in terms of the crowd fund, what I think is so maybe important for the listeners out there is that when I was growing up, there was no such thing as crowdfunding for like a horror film. Like I couldn't have been involved on any one of those movies, even on the lowest budget levels, because it didn't exist. But the reality is today is you can make a difference on a movie like this. Not only can you contribute to it financially, but that also has an effect where if you take a certain perk, you can be in the movie, you can be on the set. Maybe you want to learn directing. Maybe you want to meet our rock star Ron Keel. Maybe you want to meet our Playboy playmate who's playing the leading role. You could never do that back in the 80s and the 70s and even the 90s. But today's different. And with this crowd fund, you have a chance to maybe live your dream and help us in the process. So I just think it's a really interesting time. And I kind of wish I would have had that chance. I would have loved to have been connected to a Bob Clark film or John Carpenter film or Sam Raimi film. I can only imagine what that would have been like to be on a set like that. I would have paid any amount of money to do that if I had it at that time. But you know, today's world they can't.
Yeah, I didn't. I mean, there were some filmmakers of that age that tried it. I know that Joe Dante had tried with something, and then who else raised money? Alejandro Jodorowsky. I mean, and he was successful with it. He raised a good portion of his budget that way. Um, you know, I think it's worth it because you have all these corporations trying to do away with physical media. They try to do away with this. They try to monopolize one way or another. They're always trying to monopolize this whole thing. That's why they do these series, like 9 seasons of a series, because they're trying to own it. They're trying to monopolize it. But then in that process, it opened the doors for a ton of independent films that I see keep popping up. And the good thing is that the independent, especially horror films, are the ones that everyone's talking about. Look at Damien Leone and his Terrifier films. I mean, he really, he caught the attention of the whole world with that little movie. And it just shows you that this is kind of history is repeating itself in a way. Now it's up to the movie makers to just let's blow the audience away. I have no truck with um, somebody who wants to make movies and isn't interested in blowing the audience away. I can't wrap my head around that. I have a hard time with that because all of my heroes wanted to. They really wanted to. Yeah, of course we're making it for us too. This is our movie. That's a given. But if you're not making this for an audience, then who the hell are you making it for? I can't even sit with a movie maker that says it's just for me. It's like, okay, then why are you talking about it?
Exactly. And God bless Damien, for pulling that off with his, Terrifier films. And I know he's got another one coming. I think it's great. I'd much rather see that than some sort of big studio film because he had a unique voice. Whether you like the extreme gore or not, he had a unique voice. He presented the way he wanted to do it in his own way, and he was successful at it. And you got to give him props. I just think we need more of that. We need more of those people pushing it. And I don't mean necessarily extreme gore, but the filmmakers out that has something different to say, let them do it because that's what's going to make it better than just seeing this monotony of the same old that are created by a group of higher power people. I just rather would see the independent voices because you're going to get something that's different, whatever that may be. I appreciate that so much more. So I'm all about that, and I totally support that.
Right. And here's the thing, like the you know, what a difference a day makes. You're ready to put in everything that you have inside, everything you collectively learned over this time period, and you're ready to, like we were talking about earlier, to kick your own ass into making this powerful, over the top, motion picture. Because I think if you say, look, I'm going to shoot for the moon with this thing, for better or for worse, I'll be like Icarus. I'll burn, my wings will burn, I'll fly to the ground, but it doesn't matter. I want to fly as high as possible, making this thing, making it, creating the picture. That's how I feel. I'm going to go for it every single time, no matter how little money I have. I'm going to say, hey, I'm putting everything I have into this, everything, and I don't care who likes it or who doesn't. Hopefully, some people do, but I'm still going to put everything I have into it. And I think to be part of something like that is wonderful because we're living in partially an artless society right now. You're even talking about that in your new movie with the AI stuff. It's like this is an artless society. The AI algorithm has taken over. The algorithm is telling people how you should make your videos, how you should do this. You need to rebel against that algorithm. That algorithm is making us artless. So independent art is the greatest because there is no committee telling you what to do. There's no committee telling you who you have to. I mean, I know of some projects where they're literally picking directors by color or gender, and it's not a fun thing to hear or see. So I'm just being honest about that. It should be because the movie makers qualified for the job. We need a good movie maker for this, and of course a person that can get along with everybody. But it shouldn't just be because of the color of their skin or their gender or whatever. It just needs to be that they're great at what they do. That's the most important part, that they understand it, that they're mature enough to understand it and go forward and tackle this project and make a great motion picture. That's what we need.
Absolutely. And look, way before the all these different societal movements, um, I've always just seen people as people.
I agree. And I I ask, and I really appreciate this tonight, Terry. It's been a great conversation, and it's difficult to condense 30 years of life experience into 2 hours. But I think there's some great stories here, and I think people will understand who you are now, more so by listening to these stories, by listening to you going through your life chronologically. Um, I ask everybody this on the way out. We started with where you were born, uh, and there's no right or wrong answer to this. But if you believe we go on after this physical existence, and when you do leave this world, what will you take with you?
Oh, I think what I would take with me is the experiences that I went through that I guess you could probably say good and bad, but the ones I'd take with the most would be the ones I shared with my family, my friends, obviously my experience as a director. That's a very big part of my life. Like someone said to me once, "What would you be without films?" I can't even imagine that because it's such a big part of my life. And truthfully, as much as I love my family, which is crucial, um, without films, I'm not whole. That is that makes me complete. So doing this movie in 50 days that we're gonna do with whatever resources we have, that's going to be something that gives me great satisfaction. And it's the process. It's not just the end result. It's working with those actors, being out on those locations, even trying to raise the money now. It's all part of the process. So to answer your question, it'd be those experiences I went through in my life, both good and bad, especially with my friends, family, and my filmmaking existence. That's what I'll take with me.
Welcome back to Off to the Witch. I'm your host, Christopher Garatano, and I want to thank you for joining the conversation tonight. Motion pictures are my life. So much can be learned not only if we patiently open our minds and imagination to the movies themselves, but also the story of the artists behind them. It's something that could never authentically shine through a movie made by committee, and a true vision is lost in that process. It's a unique voice that is one essential element that makes movies worth watching. Until next time.